Hey mamas, each time I talk about cervical checks, I get lots of feedback and questions from moms, and the most often asked question I get is, are cervical checks mandatory? So in this video, we are answering that question so that you can be informed and confident about getting or not getting a cervical check in labor. I'm Bridget, a childbirth educator and birth doula, and it's my goal to empower and educate as many parents as possible about all things pregnancy, birth, and beyond. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss any future videos. So first of all, what is a cervical or vaginal exam? A cervical check is an internal exam that a care provider will do to gather information on your cervix. They will place 2 fingers into the vagina and move them up to the cervix, which is at the top of the vagina, to feel it. Cervical exams are mostly done at the end of pregnancy and then during labor. Sometimes, if you're showing signs of preterm labor, a cervical exam might be recommended to see if the cervix is changing and opening earlier than it should be. Secondly, what is the purpose of a cervical check? Usually a care provider is looking for a few things: the dilation, or how open the cervix is, its effacement, or how thinned out it is, the position, whether it's pointing posteriorly toward the back or anteriorly toward the front, and the consistency of the cervix. Is it hard or soft and stretchy? All of that information is great at telling you where you are right now or what your body is like at the moment of the cervical exam. But really, beyond that, it doesn't do you much good. A woman's cervix could be 3 centimeters dilated for weeks before her labor begins. Or a woman could have a long, closed, and hard cervix and go into labor the next day. The state of your cervix when an exam is given does not predict the future. So when it comes down to it, are you allowed to refuse a cervical exam? And the answer is absolutely yes, you are. It is your vagina, and your autonomy over your body doesn't change because you're pregnant or in labor. During pregnancy, some care providers routinely do cervical exams between 36 to 40 weeks of pregnancy. You certainly can have your provider check you, but like I said before, it will only give you information on the current state of your cervix. It will not predict anything beyond that check. Cervical exams in a healthy pregnancy are definitely up to you. Just be sure you make it clear to your care provider early on in the appointment whether or not you are wanting a cervical exam done. In some hospital settings, you might encounter a care provider telling you that you have to get cervical checks in labor. In this case, it's important to understand why they are recommending it. Often, routine checks are done before you're admitted, a few times during labor to check on your progress, and then before you begin pushing. Here are some thoughts on these cervical checks. Many hospitals only want to admit mamas who are so many centimeters dilated to ensure they are truly in labor. Now, most of the time, a woman who is deep in labor is going to have very specific signs that show labor is indeed established. Surges will be at least 3 to 5 minutes apart consistently. She cannot talk through them. Maybe she is even vocalizing through them. And then between those contractions, she is not herself. She is distant. It's hard for her to focus on speaking or thinking. Now, one of the reasons why learning how to find comfort in labor is so crucial is because it allows you to labor at home for as long as possible. If a woman has no coping techniques for her intense surges, she may come to the hospital early on, only at 2 or 3 centimeters dilated, thinking she's more progressed than she really is because of the discomfort she is experiencing. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of moms using the de-stressor breath that I talk about in this video up here, as well as the comfort measures that I teach in the Built to Birth course that's linked down below, as well as a free mini birth class that are able to labor at home that whole time and show up at the hospital ready to push already because they were able to surrender to their surges and find comfort through each contraction. Getting a cervical check at the hospital before being admitted might be beneficial if you are willing to go back home, if you are not as progressed as you think you are. Regardless of the circumstances, however, it is still totally up to you to get a cervical exam done, although you will likely get some pushback if you do decline getting one. It's okay to stand your ground or to have your birth team do it for you if it's important to you to not get that vaginal exam. Now, intermittently throughout labor, you'll also likely have care providers requesting cervical exams. This usually is to make sure that you are making progress. In labor, especially especially without numbing medication like an epidural, cervical exams can be extremely uncomfortable because it requires you to lie on your back, put your knees out to the side, and be still while someone checks your cervix, which is basically next to impossible during a surge. Again, it's important to understand why your care team is recommending a cervical exam. Often it's because they want to keep labor moving along. Now, birth can be lengthy, but as long as mom and baby are healthy, there is really no need to rush the process, especially if mom's water bag is still intact. And always, before we add power, like in the form of Pitocin, which intensifies the surges, we want to focus on position. We ask, what is the position of the baby and how can we optimize it to keep labor moving forward? Now, one thing I want to add quickly before moving on to our final reason for cervical exams is that cervical exams during labor can help determine the position and station of a baby by feeling their head. This can provide information to a skilled nurse or doula to know which labor positions to use to encourage labor progress. For example, a baby at station -2 is still high in the pelvis and needs to be engaged. So we'd work on opening the pelvic inlet, which is at the top of the pelvis. A baby whose back of the head is felt on mama's back would be a posterior baby. So we might put mama in an all fours position to help turn baby so the back of their head is resting on the front of mama or facing her hip. Okay, finally, cervical exams are done before it's time to push. This is really only done in a hospital setting. Most out-of-hospital midwives and some hospital midwives will encourage mama just to listen to her body and let it lead the way for when to push. Many women are told not to push until they receive a cervical check, which when you're having an unmedicated birth is basically impossible because of the fetal ejection reflex, which causes your body to involuntarily push. You don't have a ton of control over it. This cervical exam is probably one of the most unnecessary ones to receive unless you have an epidural and you can't feel your body's natural urge to push, or you've had a swollen cervix earlier in labor and your care provider needs to make sure it is no longer swollen and fully dilated before pushing. In some circumstances, women have the urge to push prematurely, which in rare cases can damage the cervix. But again, this is not the norm. The norm, like we see in every other mammal, is that the female bodies are built to birth, and this is true for human women. Our bodies are wise and intuitive and know when to birth our babies. The last question I'm answering is, why would I not want a cervical exam? For some mamas, cervical exams are overwhelming and discouraging because they aren't seeing as much cervical dilation as they want. Side note right here, dilation is not everything. I have a video that I'm linking right up here that talks all about how labor progresses and how it's measured, and dilation is not the only thing to look at. But getting back on track, some moms, on the other hand, want more cervical exams to know where they are and the progress that they're making. No matter what camp you fall in, you have the right to consent or refuse to as many or as few cervical exams as you'd like. Some women have dealt with trauma in the past that makes cervical exams very scary and traumatizing. Mama, if this is you, my heart goes out to you. I encourage you to tell your care provider, even if it's vaguely, that you have dealt with trauma in your past and that vaginal exams are triggering and that you would like to avoid them. More and more care providers are practicing trauma-informed care. Another reason you may want to avoid cervical exams is because you've experienced an uncomfortable or painful one already. Cervical exams should not be rough. They should be gentle, although often might still be slightly uncomfortable. If during a cervical exam you feel mistreated or uncomfortable, you can always say, "Stop right now. I do not give you permission to continue." And then you refuse the next one or ask for someone else to do the exam instead of the person who did it before. Your care provider should never say, "It's time for your cervical exam," or "I'm going to do your cervical check now." They should always ask and always wait for your consent or your refusal. And lastly, if your water is broken, you will definitely want to limit the number of cervical checks you get. The more exams you receive, the higher the risk is of infection. Mama, bottom line, this is your birth and your body. It is not their vagina, it's yours, so you always have the final say. Your choice might not be a popular one, but if it's paving the way for your empowering birth experience, it is worth speaking up and standing your ground. Birth team, make sure you are advocating advocating for mama's birth preferences, whether that's asking for another cervical exam or refusing them. Cervical exams are just one of the many choices you will be met with in labor. Be sure to check out the free mini birth class link down below that shares with you the top 5 foundational tips for a happier, healthier, and easier birth. So thanks for being here with me in this video, and I'll see you in the next one.